Ben Riggs presents Reading D&D Aloud. Episode 35. D&D on Death Row with Keri Blakinger and Trammell.
Greetings once again, one and all, to Reading Dungeons and Dragons Aloud. I am apparently controversial historian Ben Riggs, coming to you with a gravelly throat today. I apologize. My 3-year-old was sick last night, and he has successfully passed his disease on to me. But I did not want to reschedule or cancel this recording session because I have two white hot cultural luminaries here with me to talk about a facet of Dungeons and Dragons that we have not yet discussed on this show. I want to introduce Dr. Trammell, professor of informatics at UC Irvine and author of The Privilege of Play, which you will see in the background behind me. We also have with us Keri Blakinger, who is a reporter at the LA Times. Her piece, The Dungeons and Dragons Players of Death Row, appeared in the New York Times Magazine and on the Marshall Project website. Thank you both for being here and tolerating my awful voice.
Well, since we've never spoken before, I don't have any context here. So maybe you just have a very colorful voice. Thanks for having
Kind
me.
of like the gravelly aspect. It's a hard-hitting tone of the podcast, I think. Supports it like a
So,
sleuth.
on a happier day, I would probably read aloud from Carrie's amazing article, but I'm going to save everyone that misery. I may steal some of the amazing recording of the article that can be found on the New York Times website and insert a little bit here. Because I want to say the performer who reads your article aloud was absolutely amazing. I both read your article and then listened to it again to prepare for this. But let me just start out by asking you, uh, what would you tell someone about the article if they didn't know anything about it but the title? Because again, our audience is coming in here without knowing anything about it and probably not having read it.
I usually describe it as being about two guys on Texas death row who used Dungeons and Dragons as a way to bond with each other and overcome the isolation of decades of solitary confinement.
That is a beautiful way to put it. Um, so in the article, you describe the difficult conditions that they are kept in and playing in. Um, you say in Texas, sometimes the only physical contact they get is with guards putting handcuffs on them and taking them off. So, what was it like to research this article with your subjects in such restrictive conditions?
So death row reporting is really logistically challenging. I started covering Texas death row when I was at the Houston Chronicle in like 2018, maybe. So I was covering a lot of the court cases and I was covering the executions, and I was also going and visiting guys on death row regularly and trying to learn more about what life there was actually like. I think that was a way that people hadn't really covered death row that much before. I think the prior death row reporters had focused a lot on the legal proceedings and, the conclusion, as it were. But I decided to find out a little bit more about what the actual conditions and lives there were like. And it's difficult as a reporter because you're dealing with people who are obviously reluctant to trust the media. Most of the coverage about them has been, pretty squarely focused on the worst thing they've ever done. And they also know that if they talk to you, pretty much anything they say publicly can be used against them in some capacity eventually. If they do an interview and they are intellectually disabled, but they somehow came off as like a little too cogent, then they might worry that in a few years, if the state tries to set an execution date, they may use some prior interview to argue that this person is not really intellectually disabled, and thus should remain eligible for execution. So this is a population that has a lot of reasons to be wary of reporters. And, it took me years of covering it to be trusted by enough of the guys that I could tell a story like this. The first time I heard about it, though, was pretty early on when one guy that I was interviewing sort of casually mentioned that they played Magic the Gathering and they played D&D. And I was like, wow, those are good stories. But it took me years from that point to be able to actually have something that I could make into a story, let alone a long form story like this. In part because of the isolation, a lot of them didn't know the real names of people that they'd been playing with every day. They knew their prison names. They knew the names that they, called through the cell grates, or through the toilets as they're trying to converse. So it took me a while to track down some of the other players and figure out who would be able to tell their own story and had a sort of compelling story that could really highlight the ways in which this game is such a lifeline for them. And it took me a while to, nail down all that and eventually make a story out of it. But on top of that, there's all the restrictions about interviewing them. So even once I knew who I wanted to focus on and what the story would look like, I could still only do 1 hour interview with each person every 90 days. So like the two main characters in this, Tony and Billy, I could only talk to for 1 hour every 90 days. So logistically, it's just slow.
Yeah, that is hard to imagine getting only 1 hour every 90 days. And was that in person or on the phone?
So that was in person and it's through plexiglass. Like you have, you're talking on a phone that's on a recorded line and you're looking at them through plexiglass, which is also just a nightmare in terms of like photo and video. It's like
Yeah.
the worst setup ever for a photographer, right? The really disappointing thing, I mean, there's obviously a lot of disappointing things about all of this reporting in that realm, but one of the disappointing things is that that meant I could never witness their games, right? Like I could never sit there as they're playing. I could never be like, okay, show me your setup. Like they can send me their papers that they've written up about their characters or what things they've drawn. They can send me their spinners because they used spinners instead of dice. But like I can't ever actually see what their setup is. I can't watch how they interact. And that's so limiting when you want to really give people a sense of their world. But this is just one of the difficulties about telling sort of human stories on death row or in prisons in general.
So Tony and Billy were both on death row in Texas. And what role did D&D play in their lives and in their friendship?
So, I mean, I think it's part of why they ended up even becoming friends. Because Billy was a white guy from deep East Texas, and Tony was a black guy who'd come from Detroit and then ended up catching his case in El Paso. So they had, pretty different backgrounds, and they wouldn't have necessarily at the time that they both came to the row in the mid 90s, mid to early 90s, they wouldn't have necessarily been hanging out that much given the different demographics there. But they ended up becoming friends and, playing D&D some together over the years. Um, and I mean, they both said that this is probably not a friendship that would have blossomed if they hadn't had the game to tie them together like that.
And I want to say it was Billy who was the DM. Is that correct?
Yeah, they both DM'd over the years, but Billy was particularly known and respected for being a DM. Um, I I've had a number of the guys that I talked to say that it felt like it was almost like to some degree like therapy session when he was running the games, that he was really interested in trying to help the guys explore parts of themselves and their pasts and there was, I don't remember if I ended up putting this in the story, but there was, they both, I think, recounted for me one guy who'd been struggling with drug use. I mean, on death row, like they were, there's been times where there's been lots of drugs on death row and times where there hasn't been. I mean, drugs are pretty prevalent in prisons in general, but death row, it's a little different. And I don't think there's as much drug use happening on Texas death row now as there has been at some points. At one of these points, there was a lot of crack smoking going on, and there was somebody that was struggling with that pretty heavily. And they ended up discussing that with him in the context of the game. Like his character was interested in always trying to be fucked up. I don't remember what substances they had access to in their game world, but they called him on it and like started talking him through it and being like, okay, but why? Why are you doing this? Like, don't like you have consequences for your character and also for you. And I don't remember if I ended up even putting that in the story. But like
My
that,
recollection is not. I listened to it again today and I don't recall
okay.
that, but
Okay. I think it was because the guy in question was not still around to verify that. But yeah, I mean, I thought like that was a pretty concrete example. But there's a lot more sort of squishier examples that they would tell me where they'd be helping some of these guys talk through their interpersonal conflicts and their pasts and stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think partly because of the way that he ran games, Billy became really respected as a DM. I also remember one of the things that I mean, I don't actually play D&D. My reference point here is basically just reporting on it. Um, but I remember hearing at one point that when they had all been in solitary with nothing, there had been an escape around like 2000, and afterwards they were all put in solitary with nothing, and Billy was DMing a game just out of his head, which I was like, I don't really know a lot about D&D. That seems hard as hell, like from what I understand.
let me
Um,
pass that to Aaron here. Do you think that's a difficult thing to do?
I mean, it depends on how good the game was, I'd say. I think it's a difficult thing to do
Fair.
well.
Okay.
Easy to learn, difficult to master, right? We all do that as kids. We call it make believe, um, on some level. But I do think that, like, memorizing the rules, and having a fully, thought out world that feels real and feels like it's been, kind of lived in. That's a bigger accomplishment. And if the players were singing Billy's praises, yeah, that does sound kind of hard. The other thing I wanted to just put some language, that folks in like the role playing community use to talk about this stuff. But it's unusual to see it coming out in Dungeons and Dragons, which is famously a game that's kind of, slapstick, kind of lighthearted. But in the story that you told us about these folks on death row, they were doing things that I think folks in the role-playing game community would call playing close to home, which means like playing a character that tells a story, that's just like your own life, and Bleed, where, the things in the game world have meaning for you in the real world. And so there's kind of like an emotional takeaway from the game or a residue that imprint that kind of leaves behind. And so yeah, this is, some serious role playing happening in, I think, in some ways, the unlikeliest of places, which is Dungeons and Dragons, also a prison. So some really cool stuff happening there.
So one of the things I obsess about is, again, we call D&D a game, but I think it's a new medium in many ways that we're still struggling with the creation of. And I think one of the things you can do with that is it's like, karaoke, but for narrative. Like you can sit down with your friends and you can tell a story together, and maybe it will have some meaning for your personal lives. And your article is just such an incredible example of how D&D can be used to create stories that do have meaning, and help us make sense of our lives. And again, under some of the most crushing circumstances imaginable. I kind of hate to rush to this question, but I'm just going to do it. So Billy Wardlow got a date for his execution, and he had time for one more campaign. Do you recall? Can you tell our listeners about that, or has it been too long?
Um, I feel like I have a lot of games going around in my head.
Okay.
Um,
If that's a bad question, I can ask a different one.
yeah, I would have needed to
It's
reread
okay.
that
I
because
mean, I will
they
say that
couldn't.
that's like definitely the emotional. That's part of the article that I read, and it just like hits you in the gut at the end.
You know what? I'll insert the a reading here from that. That's a smart thing to do. Let me just
Yeah,
write that down.
I feel like I need to. Um, I'm always worried I'm going to fuck it up when I'm talking about D&D because I
Here.
don't know
Well,
like,
first
I'm
of
not
all,
a
let me tell
native.
you, having read a lot of people who don't know much about D&D write about D&D, I thought you did a smashing job. I didn't know you didn't play D&D, but I'll read you my notes. Good job explaining the game. You know, so I thought you did marvelously. Unless Aaron wants to disagree, feel free to disagree, Aaron,
No,
but I thought
I
you did
love.
good.
I think this is a beautiful article, and I'm probably gonna send it to my class in the the next quarter. I have a role playing games class, so I think this is perfect article to kind of
Cool.
get them to think outside of the box of like how they usually think about games like this.
Oh, that's so cool.
So I found the passage in your piece, and I'm just going to read this aloud, and maybe we'll replace it because I'm in not a good place where reading goes. But um, as the weeks crept along and the execution date remained firm, Wardlow and Ford, and that's Tony and Billy, Wardlow and Ford realized they were trapped in a storyline they were powerless to imagine their way out of. Quote, "You have this certain reality," Ford told me. "Not only are they telling you that one of your best friends that you consider your brother is going to die on this particular day, but you have pretty much nothing you can do about it." End quote. In the spring of 2020, Wardlow decided to start one last game. A smaller, simpler campaign that he created for a few of his friends, involving a mythical city and a quest to save a magic sword. Quote, "I'm sure you've seen those final episodes of your favorite shows," Wardlow wrote to me in his last letter on June 24th, 2020, which he composed on his prison typewriter. "That's what this is like. Although I hope this isn't the final episode." End quote. 2 weeks later, the state executed him. And again, I hear that and I think to myself, I could, if I were in that similar position, I could see myself doing something akin to that, where, if I, God forbid, I got cancer or something, or, perhaps I ended up on death row. It seems unlikely, but I'm sure it doesn't seem likely to anyone. Um, I could see myself thinking, I'm gonna run one more game. I'm gonna tell one more story. I'm gonna, pack it in with my friends one more time. So that was a part that struck me as particularly powerful and moving, and just showing the unique way that, again, my language is D&D gives meaning to life and helps you make sense of what is happening to you. But feel free, if Aaron wants to disagree, that's fine.
No, but that was the exact line I was thinking about. And I was also thinking because I think he had a stay of execution that he was supposed to be executed earlier. And so like, he's had that extra episode. And so it's not just wishful thinking, I think that, it's been a real thing in his life where he had the experience that the state doesn't always carry through what it says it's going to do and stuff. So I don't know, it's really profound that part.
So you mentioned,
So,
sorry, go ahead. Please go ahead.
I really like that you started that you, or actually, I was going to say that you started reading, but I don't know if you're going to leave that in as reading. Well, I'm okay.
Who
I really
knows? We'll
like
figure
that.
it out.
I really like that you started that with one of Tony's quotes because my editor actually cut out the rest of this quote, and I love what he was saying here. You read the part of, you have this certain reality, Ford said. Not only are they telling you that one of your best friends that you consider your brother is going to die on this particular day, but that you pretty much have nothing you can do about it. So, first of all, I think that quote gets at a really important thing about why D&D means so much to people on death row or in prison in general. Because in prison in general, you have just so little agency, right? You have so few situations in which you can make choices, especially if you are in solitary all the time. Like agency and like just the ability to make choices is so much of what how we do the things that define ourselves as humans. Like this is how we know who we are, right? And we have so little ability to make choices. But the game world gives them this whole universe of choices that is not constricted by prison walls or, the rules or the guards. And I think that's part of why this is such a important way for bonding with each other and, exploring who you are and, figuring out your own like IRL character. But the rest of that quote is he was talking about obviously the days before Billy's execution. And in that time, he had also agreed to write an affidavit for Billy's clemency petition. He doesn't typically do a lot of those. Some people do affidavits for other clemency petitions all the time. Tony didn't do a lot of them. But he agreed to do that one, and he agreed to do any news interviews that would help Billy. And he told me, or the rest of that quote was, he said, "We were trying to show the world, we were trying to show the people in power and the people that's going to make the decision of life and death over Billy's life, that his life is worth something, that his life has meaning." And I just like that so much because he is saying that it's his ability to tell Billy's story that is how he can show the world that his life had meaning. So obviously, as a reporter, as someone who tells people stories, like when he said that, I was like, "Oh wow, okay, that one really resonates with me." So,
Aaron,
anyways,
Aaron, you want to
more
respond to that?
content.
Because otherwise, I'm going to jump on it.
I mean, I have a question, which is like, what are the other ways that, as a reporter on this stuff, people like find that meaning at the end, right before an execution? It can't just be Dungeons and Dragons. So, like, what are the other techniques and tools that they have?
So I mean, I don't think that everyone does find that meaning at the end, right? But I mean, it varies. One of the other ways is there's a radio station at that prison. I also wrote a story about that. Um,
I'll
and
put a link to that in the show notes.
Cool. It's for general population, but when they allowed the general population guys to start this radio station, which is a low watt station, so basically it's only on the prison property that you can really hear it, which makes it really special because it's like they know the outside world isn't listening to them and like passing judgment in the same ways. This is content that is made for prisoners and by prisoners. And the death row guys have been for the past like 3 years, I guess, allowed to contribute to the station by writing letters, writing essays, and sending them to the guys who run the station, which may not sound like a lot, but it is pretty unprecedented because normally if you are in prison, you can't write a letter to another prisoner. Like that is against the rules. And certainly if you are on death row, you're not allowed to be writing little notes to the guys in GP. So prior to this radio station, there was no officially like permitted contact between GP and death row guys. And that was pretty effective. There was really not much contact happening. But this radio station gave them a chance to have a voice and to, let the rest of the prison know who they are and, what led them there and what their stories were. And some of them found a lot of meaning out of that. I actually have a short documentary that I co-produced that came out recently that ended up being about one of the guys that was deeply involved in the radio station. It's not about his involvement in the station, but in the course of our interviews, I found that was something that was deeply meaningful to him because he talked some about how, he knew he was going to be executed and the only thing that he can leave behind is his words. Which again, I thought was something that was really powerful, but that was something that, he got a lot of meaning out of. Obviously, there's some people that find that sort of meaning out of religion. I think that's a pretty common thing to turn to. I mean, not common, but it's one of the more popular things, I guess, to turn to at the end there. But yeah, I don't know. Those are some of the other things.
Yeah, it's so interesting the dichotomy between the two because you've got uh the radio station, which is all about like broadcasting your interior life to so many other people, and then Dungeons and Dragons, which is so intimate and about the sort of interior life of imagination shared between like a close-knit group of friends, or even like I think in this example, it seems like it's just two people playing together for a good deal of the campaign.
How did they manage to play in solitary?
Um, Sorry, I can't answer that one on the,
Okay, that's fine.
I, I mean, I can give, or I don't know.
You
I mean, I
just you
can
can
give you an
that's
answer,
fine.
but it isn't a full answer. I had to, um, okay. So, I mean, how they play in solitary, there's some parts of it I can't talk about and that we didn't go into detail in the story. But it's varied a little over the years. Sometimes there would be one person that would get out for rec because they would give them rec alone. So they'd have one person that was out for rec and would be able to like shout to some of the people in the nearby cells. Sometimes they would be passing notes or just shouting. There was one prison that the old death row that they'd been at had cells with bars at the front, so they were kind of open and they could just casually talk out the cells. And then when they would do at the later prison that they were at, when they would go into these outdoor rec kennels, they would like talk through the wire. So I mean it there's a number of ways that they would figure out moments where they would be able to talk. But it was that and note passing and and I don't know, other creative ways.
Wow. And you mentioned that they were not allowed books. They were not allowed D&D books, I should say, to use in playing their games. So would they create their own rule books?
No, so some states ban the D&D books altogether. In Texas, they were allowed to have them. They were just hard to get because they would get confiscated and then they're expensive. And obviously, those guys aren't getting it. They're not making any money. So it's hard to replace them. Some of the rules about how you can get books sent in have changed over the years. So sometimes it was logistically easier to receive them than other times. But they definitely did have some books because when Billy died, he gave his girlfriend a box of all of his D&D stuff that she then gave to me, and it included several of the books. So Texas was, I hate to say lucky, but lucky, I guess, in that respect that they were allowed to have the D&D books because some states have banned the books or the playing of the game entirely. Like I think Wisconsin
Yeah, that is
had a
correct.
court
The home
case.
of
Because it's
Yeah.
D&D has banned it.
why wait, so why is this banned? Is it because it's a game book? Is it because it's D&D?
So I couldn't tell you other than I want to say 15 years ago, a prison banned the playing of D&D, and it came before a judge, and the judge upheld it and said, "Yep, that's fine." Which is here. Let me pull it up. I'll find it right now. Give me one
So I think
second.
it's usually like some broad safety and security of the facility type thing, because it's not just Wisconsin. That's just the one that's sort of best known. There's a few other states that ban either the books or the playing. I think the Federal Bureau of Prisons has some restrictions as well, although I'm not sure they're very effective.
I was also interested you because in your article you said that I think sometimes the maps you can't bring maps in.
So maps is pretty standard. Maps are a thing that are pretty broadly banned in most prisons. I mean, I did time in New York and I remember people getting books confiscated or blocked from receiving them based on like maps on the inside covers and sometimes of just completely irrelevant places or fictional places. Um, like I remember there's some fantasy series that people had trouble getting because the maps on the inner cover would get it banned even though they weren't real places. But I mean that's about escape, which is kind of silly, especially in 2024. Like if somebody's escaping, they're going to get some sort of phone or something with some kind of GPS, and that is what they will use for their map.
So let me read a couple paragraphs from the New York Times in 2010, an article entitled Dungeons and Dragons prison ban upheld. Prisons can restrict the rights of inmates to nerd out, a federal appeals court has found. In an opinion issued on Monday, a three-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 7th District rejected the claims in a lawsuit challenging a ban on the game Dungeons and Dragons by the Waupun Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. The suit was brought by a prisoner, Kevin Singer, who argued that his First Amendment and 14th Amendment rights were violated by the prison's decision to ban the game and confiscate his books and other materials, including a 96-page handwritten manuscript he had created for the game. Prison officials said they had banned the game at the recommendation of the prison's specialist on gangs, who said it could lead to gang behavior and fantasies about escape. Which, again, as a Wisconsin resident, where Governor Tony Evers is now in charge of that Department of Corrections, it's shocking to me that it's still like that, and the idea of D&D being affiliated with gang behavior seems like some sort of weird hangover from the Satanic Panic. And some of the things,
Or
some
the
of the things she go.
goblins.
Please go ahead, Aaron. Go ahead.
No, I was just joking. Like the goblins or like
We're making up
the
D&D
mind
gangs now.
flayers.
Yeah, but like a few of the things that you wrote about Carrie just seemed to me almost like, man, they just have it out for D&D, and a lot of us that have been playing D&D for a long time have a little bit of a persecution complex about it that some of us take too far. Um, but let me ask another question so that I can stop talking and let someone else talk.
Okay,
Go
in
ahead.
fairness, like I don't think that's about having it out for D&D. I think that's about having it out for prisoners. Like there are lots of extremely absurd things that are banned, and there are lots of books that are banned for extremely absurd reasons. Like I remember when I was at the Houston Chronicle, I wrote a story about the fact that like Mein Kampf is not banned in Texas prisons, but Charlie Brown's like Christmas is. Also, the color purple is banned. Like there's a lot of things that are banned for absurd reasons, and I'm prisons just like banning shit. That's what it comes down to.
Man.
They would ban joy outright if they could, but they'll at least ban fun things instead.
Huh.
Um, can I sneak one in? This is just on the subject of bands. So you mentioned magic cards. I know this isn't D&D, but it is another Wizards property. So I was just wondering, like, because magic cards are like so valuable in the
Oh,
not
they
prison
they made
world.
their own. They made
They
their own.
made their own.
Yeah, because the thing is, you can't like even if books of a certain thing are allowed, like most random objects are not allowed. Like you can't send someone a game in prison, right? You can't send them cards. Anything that they are allowed to possess in prison, in most prison systems and in most states, is only what is allowed to be purchased on the commissary. Some states have some other ways that you can like send people a few things, but you can't just send them like random objects from the internet, like, magic cards.
And was there like an economy that developed around them self-made cards also, or not really, just fun to
I
play
don't know
with?
to what extent that happened or not. They were at the point that I started asking about this less popular than the D&D was, and I think they had always had a smaller group. But I mean, the size of any economy for that would be pretty limited because there were at that point, like I think around 200, 200 guys on death row maybe, when I started covering it. And of those, a few dozen were playing D&D, and a much smaller number were playing Magic. So like there's just not enough people for a particularly large economy. And I actually don't know, after the guy that told me about it got executed, I don't actually know who else there was that was playing that was doing anything with Magic the Gathering.
Editors do good work. But that quote about meaning that got chopped by your editor, that really did blow my mind. Sorry to step back a few feet here.
Yeah.
Um, but just the suggestion that that this man's life was of more value because of the meaning that he had found in a role-playing game is just a I feel like your article takes a magnifying glass to parts of the medium that we don't often look at and just focuses in on them. The meaning, and again, you'd already mentioned the freedom. Um, but D&D players and role-playing game players, they love the freedom of the role-playing game, but it's not a thing that we really, I think, dwell on over much unless Aaron wants to disagree with me, and please do. But again, just to see the way you showed us these prisoners uh, living things that they could not do otherwise, except through the game. Especially, again, you mentioned a lot of these guys were put away at ages like 18, 19. You talked about how like their experiences with earning money and buying things were through D&D. And unless they get some sort of a reprieve, that'll be their only experiences with that, which is just a stunning thing to consider. So again, I realize that I'm not really working up to a question. I'm just telling you what good work you did. But again, having read it twice now, I'm very, very impressed and blown away by the work that you did here.
Thank you.
So, Aaron, do you want to say anything else? Do you want to ask any other questions?
No, I mean, there's so much to think about there. Um, Yeah, I guess I'm kind of curious about some editorializing, Carrie, especially as kind of like someone who didn't necessarily grow up playing Dungeons and Dragons, but saw these really, really impactful moments um with prisoners and stuff like that. I guess like what's your take on the game just in general after watching this? Like, is it something that you're curious about personally, or are you kind of hardened and just kind of curious about it intellectually. Like I'm kind of just like, what did this experience of being so close to so many really, really um touching life moments around this game do to you as the reporter?
That's an interesting question. I don't think I've gotten that one before. Um, so I mean, I've enjoyed hearing the updates on their game world. Um, and it's just been like, I don't know, it's been so interesting because of the number of the various ways in which they have overlap between their lives and their game world. So I think I hadn't been around D&D enough to realize that people would even construct these worlds that had such noticeable echoes from their own realities. So that's been like interesting for me to see. Um, and I mean, I curious about it? Like, yeah, I like kind of, but also, I don't know. Like, there's something about I'm actually not super into like high fantasy. Like, I
It's
feel
okay. It's fine.
admitting that, but like, um, so that has been, I think, part of why I haven't like become an avid gamer as a result of this reporting. Like I really enjoy hearing the narratives. I'm a storyteller. I like hearing the narratives. But I'm not sure that I'd be the person who would like become an avid gamer myself. It is also like there is also the issue that just logistically, like this is a very potentially very time consuming pastime, right? And it has I feel like that would be difficult to work into full-time reporting and like a book on the side. And then like also I'm gonna join a D&D crew in a city where it takes 2 hours to get anywhere. Um, so I think that's also been like logistically a little challenging. In fact, I actually have been I need to find some people to watch play or to play with. Like I feel like I need to get a deeper understanding of this if I'm going to try to expand this into a book, which is currently the plan.
Do you have an agent?
Yeah, because I have a first book. So
Okay, good.
I actually wait, I think we had the same publisher for the first one, right? Were
St.
you
Martin's?
Yeah.
Yay, St. Martin's.
I actually have your book here somewhere. I haven't read it yet, but I've had it
That's
for some
okay.
time.
I have Aaron's behind me, and I haven't read it yet either. It's advertising.
So
Uh,
I forget why I saw that it was coming out, and then I knew that it was the same publisher. So I reached out to my editor and was like, "Hey, can you get me a copy of this?" So I've had it for a while and I haven't read it yet.
well,
Um,
look, we're all busy. It's okay.
And Carrie, I will say, if you do want to play Dungeons and Dragons, like just hop down the 405. I'll run you a game, do a one shot, and you can have the experience if you'd like.
yeah, and
Aaron has an excellent reputation, by the way.
Not as a DM
excellent.
though.
Yeah, and I also would be intrigued to visit your role-playing gaming class.
Oh, great. Yeah, I was gonna extend an invitation to both of you if you're interested, not necessarily simultaneously, but I'd love to have visitors. I try to, that's a class that I try to bring people into. So if you all are interested in coming through, that would be fantastic.
I might be coming to LA in February. We'll see. I was invited to a gaming convention, and after some recent comments online, I was disinvited. And of course, it came after I'd bought
Ooh.
plane tickets. So I have some money running around that I can use for plane tickets. But then this morning I took my 3-year-old to the emergency room, and now I'm like, how much is that going to cost me?
Oh
So
no.
I'm kind of thinking about coming out in February. If I do, I'll let both of you know.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
please.
Because how far are you from LA, Aaron?
Oh, an hour.
Oh, that's nothing in the world
Yeah,
of in this world.
yeah. It's nothing, and I'd be very happy to drive up. If that's
You can also take the train. The train goes to Irvine. The
it
Amtrak
kind
does.
of it, yeah, but you got to get to downtown LA. You got to get to DTLA, and
Yes.
then you got to get from the Irvine train station, which is by the mall, to where I live.
So, Carrie, can I ask you for a favorite book or movie or TV show or anything like that?
Of anything like just
Yeah,
randomly?
well, no, one of your favorites. What do you enjoy? What's
What
media
about
you enjoy?
um I I really like this is so off base. I
Don't
really
worry, I'll bring it
like
back. I'll bring it back. Don't worry.
okay. I really like old film. I like noir. I love it's kind of trite. I love Hitchcock. I love North by Northwest. I think Notorious is probably my favorite movie. I don't know.
See, Aaron, an investigative Cthulhu game. That's where I would start then.
Yeah.
Because again, I like D&D just fine, and I'm a huge tabletop role playing game nerd. But it's in no way it's never been my primary role playing game. I'm much more into like Call of Cthulhu, which is based on H.P. Lovecraft's works. And it's a lot of 1920s, like, oh, someone is dead, fish people did it. Ah. Um, and again, I think that is in some ways an easier start into the role playing game world than D&D, especially if you don't like high fantasy and if you're like, I wish I was at Rick's in Casablanca. But again, uh, you do you, man, of course.
But there are like for role-playing games, there are so many amazing things out there. I mean, I'm a weirdo. I like OSR games, even though I kind of detest them intellectually. But so I guess my lizard brain and my brain are not totally in alignment there. OSR means old school Renaissance. It's like a very old kind of Dungeons and Dragons. Um, but like there's just amazing role-playing games coming out these days that are like there's one Alice is Missing. You play it just by texting people on your phones and the story unfolds and I don't know, by the end you're like crying and having goosebumps and stuff. It's just there's some really cool stuff out
See, now
there.
you've allowed us to stumble into let us tell you how awesome our hobby is. So
Yeah.
we must be winding down then. I'm gonna check my notes. Aaron, if there's anything else you want to ask, feel free.
No, it's a delight to chat with you, Carrie. I just your work is amazing, and yeah, I'm excited that you might have a book on this topic. That's awesome. So, congratulations! I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
Yeah, when the time comes, either if you just need an opinion or if you need a blurb, please send it to me. I'll gladly do either. Um, because again, it was a magnificent piece of work, and I'm again twice as impressed given that it's not a passion of yours because you represented it so well. And I guess I would add, I feel like typically there's at least one like tweak of the nose or finger in the eye if a writer is not kind of into D&D at some point they're like, well, they are basement dwelling nerds, but there was no moment of that in your work. Like I had as a question, so tell me about playing D&D, and then you're like, well, I don't play D&D, and I'm like, I can cross that off the list. Um, but let me ask this. So what is your first book and where can my listeners get it?
Oh, it is called Corrections in Ink. And I mean, it's, in bookstores, it's on Amazon, it's wherever. It is a memoir about how I went from, having been in prison and doing time to being a reporter who covers prisons.
Well, that just
Awesome.
makes me want to ask questions about that, but I won't because we're winding down. So Aaron, I got a book by you behind me. Um, is the best way for people to support you to go and pick that up? Is there a Patreon? Anything else people can do for you?
Yeah, so yeah, I'd say pick up my book, The Privilege of Play. It's about the history of race and hobby games over the course of the 20th century. Um, it's a dry academic book, so if that's not for you, don't pick it up. But if you do, pick it up and read it. And then keep an eye out. I will have a book coming out on the cultural history of Dungeons and Dragons next year. And so that will be probably a little more accessible than The Privilege of Play, which is more of an academic history. This one was written more for a popular audience.
Yeah, who's going to publish the cultural history one?
It's coming out in Duke University Press, which is
Nice.
another academic press, but it's a shorter book, and it's really trying to take seriously, I think, the sort of computational history of Dungeons and Dragons, the work that Gary Gygax did around that topic, but also his personal life and how his personal like proclivities and interests really influenced both Dungeons and Dragons, but also many other games that followed it, for better and for worse.
I can't wait. We will have to have you on to discuss it since yeah. Um, All right, I will close by briefly saying, hey, this podcast has a Patreon. If you want to support it, please go and join our Patreon. It is a mere $3 a month, and if my inclination holds, we will never have another tier. My gut instinct is to make that $3 tier so good that a ridiculous percentage of you go and support the show. Uh, we are going to be having on there extra episodes with me and Dr. Scott Bruner reading aloud the Dungeon Master's Guide. I'm going to read aloud sample chapters from my next book, tentatively titled "Total Party Kill: The Battle for the Soul of D&D in the 21st Century." So you can expect that on there. We have a Discord, which I'm terrible about checking, but I need to do better. But yeah, if you just want to support the show and get extra content, less than the price of a cup of coffee in California will get you that. Um, with that, I
That's
just want to
true.
say, Aaron, I'll have to have you on again sometime to talk about other things because this has been a total delight speaking with you. And I know we've talked on Facebook. But I don't recall if we ever met before.
No, I don't think so. But I am at Gen Con every year, so if you're at Gen Con, that's an easy place to meet up.
I regularly go. I'm not sure if I'm gonna. I have to go. I have to go for at least a day. Last Gen Con was not a good experience, but now again we're wandering off into the
Yeah.
weeds. Keri, again, when your book gets closer, anything you need, please let me know if you want to come on again. If you wanted to, if you were like, hey, I'd like to have hundreds of nerds give me feedback on a chapter. We can acquire hundreds of nerds for you. Just let us know because this has been
Noted.
amazing. Thank you so much. I'll stop talking to let you talk now.
No, that's it. This has been delightful. I'm so glad to have met you both.
Well, if I come to LA, I'll let you both know. I'm going to take some NyQuil and go to bed. And you two have a great rest of your day. Aaron, enjoy your chicken. Keri, it was great to meet you. Bye bye.
Bye,
Bye.
folks.